I next call upon Dr. Pratik Tambe. He is the ART consultant and endoscopic surgeon at Nirmati Fertility and IVF Center and Kumar's Endoscopic Surgery Center in Mumbai. He has had a fellowship in IVF and ICSI at Brussels in Belgium with Dr. Paul Devroy. He is trained in ART and third-party reproduction with Dr. Gautam Alawadia.
I've been privileged to be part of this team, albeit for a short time in my reproductive career, if I may so call it. The speakers who've come before me have done an excellent job and rendered most of my talk redundant. So there's precious little for me to add actually. What my talk initially was supposed to be an evaluation of the different methodologies of triggering ovulation. Since it was meant to be a comparison of different ways of triggering ovulation, I thought it was probably best that I should speak after the other two speakers who talk about whether or not ovulation induction needed to be necessarily followed by an HCG trigger and whether the pregnancy rates were going to be a little better or they were going to be worse off after we've done the ovulation triggering. So there you have it, recombinant HCG, recombinant LH and GnRH agonist to trigger ovulation, a critical evaluation. I'd like to start off by introducing you to what is called a Flieger. The Flieger is a watch which was worn by German Luftwaffe pilots during the Second World War. If you see the front, it looks completely innocuous. In fact, it looks like an ordinary watch from prehistoric times, from the 40s and 50s. It's got markings, it's got radium, so it illuminates in the dark, and it's got an off-center second hand at 6 o'clock. The beauty of the watch is revealed when you turn it around and see the back. The back of the watch has a sapphire crystal which allows you to look into the heart of the watch. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a mechanical watch which contains about 308 moving parts, which are all put together by a jeweler with a loop, as it were, in the good old days. And you will see that this beautiful watch is surprisingly accurate given the prehistoric nature of its workings. In spite of having 308 individual working moving parts, it's dead accurate to less than 2 seconds from the mean every month. It's almost as good as a quartz. It's a feat of technology, it's a marvel of engineering, and you can stare at the heart of this watch for hours and hours and be continually entertained. What is the idea of introducing you to the Flieger? No less surprising and probably much more complex is the menstrual cycle. You can spend days and days shut up with your Spiroff and marvel at the rise and fall, the ebb and flow of estradiol, progesterone, FSH and LH. And every time you go back to this graph and chart, you will find so many new things which will teach you that we are in no way superior to the marvels that Mother Nature has whittled away and made perfect over a period of 4.5 billion years. It's not my job here to talk about the menstrual cycle, but I thought it was appropriate to introduce the talk by talking about the menstrual cycle and how we mess with it and how we continually make a mess of the menstrual cycle. And yet God is great. He rewards us with pregnancies. As I'm so fond of saying, our patients, God bless them, so often conceive in spite of our best efforts and not because of them. The endometrial cycle closely parallels the fall and rise of estradiol and progesterone, and this slide tries to highlight that fact. there's a variety of protocols that have been described in literature for the simple reason that no one size fits all. There is no such thing as a perfect protocol. If you take 10 different ART consultants, each will have his own favorite protocol. Each will have learned the nuances of ovulation induction and control ovarian hyperstimulation in his own particular way, depending on which teacher he follows and how many different concepts they've been exposed to, how many congresses in Goa they have attended. Somebody will be following Marcus Nitschke, somebody will follow Brussels in Belgium, someone will follow people from the other side of the pond, and they will use FSH followed by HMG and so on and so forth. As far as planned relations and IUI cycles are concerned, most of the time, as the two very excellent speakers before me have elucidated, usually you get better results if you combine Clomid with gonadotropins. The most ideal approach would be to use gonadotropins alone, but in our resource-poor country, where funding is completely private, the patient pays for her treatment. The cost of gonadotropins is a major limiting factor, and therefore so often we have to work in a compromised setup, and therefore we combine clomiphene with gonadotropins to keep the cost of the cycle down. I'm not going to confuse you with these boring charts of what the long luteal protocol is and what the antagonist protocol is. We will move straight away to the subject of the day, which is ovulation triggering. When you stimulate the patient, it of course follows mandatorily that you must do what is called as follicular tracking. In our country, we do it ourselves. Overseas, there are specialist people in specialist situations called as sonographers who will do the ultrasound. There is a brief lag between the reporting and the action by the clinician. Here, of course, we are doing our own scans, and this is how we usually would go about it. You do a baseline scan on day 2, 3, make your stimulation protocol depending on the antral follicle count, the AMH and the FSH. You usually do a follow-up scan on day 8, 9 if it's an IUI cycle, or day 5, 6 if it's an IVF cycle, and titrate your dosages and follow-up scans every 48 hours. Follicular growth patterns, as is well known, can flummox the best of us even after doing a few thousand cycles. The odd patient does crop up where these rules of thumb are not followed. Okay, usually we say 1 to 2 millimeters a day in a natural cycle or with Clomid. If you have gonadotropin cycles, it's much faster. And if growth is more than 4 millimeters a day, you better watch out. This patient is going to go in for uncontrolled ovarian hyperstimulation and land up with OHSS. Ideally, of course, we would like to have monofollicular development where there is a single follicle, and that one single follicle is going to give us one singleton pregnancy. Unfortunately, as we've learned through bitter experience, reproduction is not an exact science. So one follicle doesn't necessarily give you a singleton pregnancy. So often than not, it doesn't give you a pregnancy. So therefore, we've now tried to stimulate with gonadotropins to achieve multifollicular development. So how much multifollicular development is good? Is 5 or 6 a good number? Probably not. The most ideal number of follicles in an IUI cycle would probably be 2 or 3, where you don't have sky-high levels of estradiol which are going to suppress your endometrium and cause poor endometrial receptivity. Of course, there's a greater chance of multifetal gestation and its attendant complications if you have multifollicular development, but that's the price you have to pay. Unfortunately, in these sad times, we have to be careful because the incidence of multifetal gestation requiring embryo reduction, landing up with premature deliveries and miscarriages is very much on the rise. It's basically like bribing the devil and getting success at any rate. And this is what we call catastrophic success. We try and avoid that at any cost as far as possible. So the question of the day is, why do you need to trigger ovulation? As the speakers before me have already done an excellent job on this, I don't really have to speak much. But it's obvious that when you have the long Eganus protocol being used, the pituitary is suppressed, and normal signaling mechanisms that are there in the ovaries and the endometrium are completely suppressed. And therefore, in these patients, it is mandatory that you need to trigger ovulation. The LH surge is of course absent in these patients. Another advantage is that you can trigger ovulation as per your convenience, as per the convenience of the patient, depending on the availability of the husband, whether or not he can take a leave and come for actually giving the sample and so on and so forth. Of course, we also practice ART of convenience so that we can come to Goa on the weekends and attend congresses like this. So we would accordingly prepone or postpone the triggering. And as the speakers before me have said, it doesn't really matter whether you prepone or postpone. Even if you were to delay by a day or two, it doesn't really significantly hamper your success rates. What are the drugs that are available for ovulation trigger? I think I gave the game away in the title of the talk. You have HCG, you have LH, and you have GnRH analogs. Each of these has its own strengths and weaknesses. It's not a question of whether this is superior or why is superior. It's a question of in which particular specialized situation you would use which. And that's what we're about to talk about. GnRH, just a quick revision, occurs in two types. It's type 1 and type 2. It's a decapeptide. And the analogs have a substitution between these particular positions, amino acids 5, 6, 6, 7, and 9, 10. The idea of creating this substitution is that native GnRH, which is produced within the body, has a very short half-life of between 6 to 12 hours. If you need to have action that is prolonged for at least 24 hours, you need to have a substitution in one of the amino acids, which would give us this entire family and this entire industry, Merck Serono, Organon, MSD, everybody, is all because of this one single substitution. This multi-billion-dollar industry is built on this one single foundation. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? HCG, of course, has two units, alpha and beta chains. The alpha unit is shared with a lot of other hormones. The beta chain is the one that gives specificity, and therefore you do a beta subunit of HCG, because if you were to assess the alpha subunit, you would be assessing a lot of other hormones as well. HCG acts as what is called as a surrogate trigger. It mimics LH activity at a much cheaper cost. And what is the mechanism of action? You replace the endogenous surge, you have a surrogate trigger, and this leads to a cascade of events. We'll go to into this in a little bit of detail, because so many of us, and it was news to me too when I read about it 10 years ago. I had long passed medical school and my MD, but I didn't know how HCG acted, and that's what I'm about to talk about. There's a very nice series called 24, and Kiefer Sutherland was Jack Bauer, one of my favorite television protagonists. After 6 seasons, CBS unfortunately went and cancelled it. If you watch the series, you will see that it's a series of 24 episodes. Each episode lasts for 1 hour, and during that 1 hour, Bauer has one chance to take care of the terrorist. So in each hour, there's a different terrorist, and so on and so forth. The chain of events unfolds. The reason why I've brought Jack Bauer up is because HCG, or the trigger, whichever you use as a trigger, is the one single chance you have to set things right during the entire cycle. You mess it up, the cycle's lost. You're not going to get ovulation, you're not going to get pregnancy. So you get only one shot at this. Remember Jack, remember 24. You get one shot at this, you need to get it right, or you've lost the entire cycle. I think this has also been answered a little while ago as to why we use HCG and why we don't use LH for triggering. Remember that the body itself has LH as a natural spike which occurs 24 hours before the actual ovulation. So why don't we use LH instead? Recombinant LH is damned expensive, and as it is, we are in a resource poor country. So to use LH for triggering would probably incur a massive cost, and if we are to use LH, it would require between 15 to 30,000 units, it has been estimated, to trigger ovulation in a single cycle. So it doesn't become cost effective outside of research settings or outside of clinical trials, which is why we've stuck to the time tested HCG. I'm not going to bore you with this. Again, I'm not going to bore you with this. You're all practicing ART consultants, you already know. The more important question to answer is, when do you administer HCG? In a planned relations or an IUI cycle, probably you would do it at around 17 to 18 millimeters. Let's not split hairs and say 17 gives us less follicles and 18 gives us more mature follicles. Usually 17 to 18 millimeters is the ideal time. If one person were to measure, he would get 17. Another person, by virtue of operator error, at the same time would probably give us 18 millimeters. If you get 4 or more follicles in a cycle, it would be worthwhile mentioning that the option should be given. You need to counsel her that probably it would be a good idea to convert this to an IVF cycle. The reason for this being that the incidence of late OHSS in multiple pregnancy is much higher if you were to have multifollicular development with 4 or more follicles, and that in itself would be what I call a catastrophic success, or success bought at any price. The advantage of doing an IVF cycle in this patient, of course, is that you can replace a finite number of embryos and prevent late OHSS from occurring. Late OHSS is one of the most deadly forms of OHSS because the patient is unmonitored. She's gone home, suddenly she lands up with cardiorespiratory embarrassment and lands up in an ICU. She's unmonitored, there are no blood tests being done, she doesn't come for follicular tracking, and the patient herself so often is not even counseled or is even aware. Forget about the patient, even we ourselves as clinicians are not really aware of what late OHSS is so often than not.